According to multiple media reports yesterday, government forces of Syria's newly seized interim government recently surrounded Russia's two major military bases in Syria, Khmeimim and Tartus. Syrian interim government troops also killed Russian sentries at the bases and issued an ultimatum: if Russian forces at the bases do not withdraw from Syria within 30 days, Syrian troops will launch a general offensive to eliminate all Russian forces in the bases. These two military bases in Syria represent Russia's most critical strategic overseas deployments, arguably without parallel. They serve not only as key pivots for Russian influence in Middle Eastern affairs, but also as vital transit hubs for projecting Russian intelligence and military power into the Middle East, Europe, and even Africa, earning them the nickname Russia's Mediterranean anchor. Currently, half of the missile radars at Russia's Tartus port base have been shut down, and intelligence stations at the base have had their power cut by Syria's new government. The Russian government has not yet responded directly to the incident, but anyone following the situation in Syria, especially viewers of our program, understands the explosive nature of this news. After all, when Russia intervened in Syria in 2015, President Putin confidently declared a mission to restore Russian presence in the Middle East, and by all accounts, the Russians succeeded at the time. When the Assad regime faced its gravest crisis under siege by rebel forces, Russian fighter jets, supported by Lebanese Hezbollah ground troops, swiftly turned the tide with minimal effort, rescuing the Assad government. But barely a decade later, not only has the Assad regime been toppled, but Russia now finds itself in mortal danger. The current Syrian interim government, though not yet in control of all Syria, dares to confront Russia openly, largely because the Ukraine war has shattered the myth of Russia as the world's second largest military power. Since 2022, Russian forces planned to capture Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, within 72 hours. Now, as the war enters its third year, the Russian military remains trapped in a prolonged attritional conflict. According to the Washington Post, Ukrainian forces have successfully halted Russian advances this year. The Russian military has lost over 160,000 lives to gain just 1,600 square kilometers of territory, less than 0.7% of Ukraine's landmass. Since 2022, Russia has failed to capture any major Ukrainian city and currently loses approximately 1,500 soldiers daily. Intelligence from Turkey and Israel reveals that over the past 12 months, Russia has withdrawn more than two-thirds of its air force and special forces from Syria to reinforce the Ukrainian front, along with nearly all its fighter jets. What remains in Syria is a skeletal Russian force struggling to maintain basic supplies. Syria's new government has thus concluded that Russia, bogged down in Ukraine, cannot or will not deploy troops to fight them. Few could have imagined that Russia, once the patron of Syria, now cannot even subdue a former proxy. Even more striking, almost all of Russia's former allies are quietly distancing themselves. Armenia, a Caucasus nation, has formally withdrawn from the Russia-led Collective Security Treaty Organization CSTO and is edging toward the EU. Kazakhstan, another former Russian client, has not openly opposed Russia but is dismantling Russian cultural centers and pivoting toward China and Turkey. Mali and the Central African Republic in Africa are breaking free from Wagner Group control and reopening ties with Western nations like France. Even longtime ally India is cooling relations with Russia, recently purchasing French weapons. In 2023, Putin visited Qatar and the UAE, touting plans to rebuild Middle Eastern order, but returned empty-handed. He has not set foot in the Middle East since. Remember, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. In 2015, it intervened in Syria. In 2016, it allegedly meddled in US and European elections. At the time, Russian geopolitics seemed unstoppable. Perhaps these early successes emboldened Putin to launch the so-called special military operation in Ukraine in 2022. But since then, Russia's fortunes have nosedived. Yet just as Syria's leaders dare to confront Russia, and even casual observers await the next act in Russia's imperial twilight, Donald Trump, president of the world's leading power, appears oblivious to the unfolding drama. Not only has Trump repeatedly praised Russians as the most battle-hardened nation for defeating Napoleon and Hitler, but in a recent interview, he claimed Russia would have captured Kyiv in 5 hours if their tanks hadn't gotten stuck in the mud. To all appearances, Trump seems cowed by Russian military might, or perhaps there are deeper motives at play. Since returning to the White House, Trump has repeatedly pushed for a Russia-Ukraine ceasefire, but his proposed terms always demand territorial concessions from Ukraine. After multiple failed attempts to broker peace siege ending in embarrassment, Trump announced just days ago that he had secured a 30-day ceasefire between the sides. Barely 24 hours later, Russia launched a massive airstrike on Kyiv. When a CNN reporter asked Trump to comment, he first dismissed the network as fake news, then stated, "Yes, I'll tell you the latest. I'm not happy with Putin. He's killing a lot of people. I don't know what's wrong with him. We've known each other a long time. We've always gotten along. But now he's firing missiles at cities like Kyiv, killing people. I don't like that at all. You understand? We were in negotiations, and he's firing missiles at Ukrainian cities. I don't like that." Pressed on what actions he would take, Trump replied, "I'm surprised, very surprised. We'll see what happens. What can I tell you? You're all fake news anyway. I just don't like what Putin's doing. Something's wrong with him. I don't like him." Notably, Trump avoided condemning Russia's targeting of civilians or expressing sympathy for Ukraine's victims. His frustration seemed rooted solely in Putin's disregard for his diplomatic posturing. This contrasts sharply with his belligerence toward others, calling Zelensky a dictator and nearly expelling the Ukrainian president from the White House. When the Syrian interim government pointed its guns at the Russian military base, the dust of the late Cold War suddenly surged in the folds of history. Once upon a time, the Soviet Red Army withdrew from Afghanistan as an ordered defender, and the armored group, although wrapped in gunpowder, still maintained the dignity of a superpower. But now the Russian troops stationed in Syria are struggling in the predicament of water and electricity outages. Half of the missile radars are silent, and the intelligence stations have become isolated islands. Even maintaining basic existence has become a luxury. This powerful force that once roared in and turned the tide of the war in 2015 has now fallen into a corner by the forces that once supported it. Even more dramatic is the game at the top of the power pyramid. The American president, who wields the tariff stick in the global trade battlefield and often humiliates other countries' leaders with the label of dictator, when faced with the Syrian government's open attack on Russia, he hesitated in his muttering, "I don't like it." When Russian missiles rained down on civilian areas in Kiev, and when the ultimatum of the Syrian interim government was slapped on the table of the Kremlin, the double-standard logic of American hegemony was fully exposed. On the one hand, it was domineering towards small countries, and on the other hand, it was ambiguous appeasement towards powerful opponents. This sense of tearing constitutes the most absurd political spectacle in the post-Cold War era. A Syrian interim government that cannot even guarantee its territorial integrity can stand up straight with the power vacuum of the great power game. A superpower leader who claims to make America great again is cautious in front of the military shadow of Moscow. When Putin's missiles crossed the plains of Eastern Europe and Trump's words were shattered into powder in the smoke of Kiev, the so-called international order is undergoing a painful birth. The collapse of the old authority and the fetal movement of the new rules occur simultaneously, and the gunshots in the Syrian desert are just a prelude to this global power reconstruction. In this era of information explosion, we have witnessed to many seemingly contradictory realities. The weak burst out amazing courage in the cracks, and the strong show unbearable timidity on the throne. But perhaps it is these tension-filled paradoxes that constitute the code for understanding this era. When the camera zooms out, the Syrian military base and the Oval Office of the White House together constitute a ukiyo-e of power evolution. Some people struggle to maintain the last dignity in the sunset of the empire, and some people look for the next fulcrum in the chaos of the alternation of the old and the new. As for the unresolved why, perhaps the answer lies deeper. When military hegemony is no longer equivalent to political authority, when economic sanctions cannot conceal strategic anxiety, any attempt to explain the world with a single logic is nothing more than a futile attempt, like a blind man touching an elephant. The only thing we can be sure of is that in this era full of uncertainty, every seemingly small confrontation may become a fulcrum for prying history. That's all for today. Stay tuned for more insights.